This video is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where you can play fantasy esports such as League of Legends and win prize money. Last week, over $200,000 were given out in prize money. Okay, MadLife, the long-time support of CJ, in this case just CJ Entus, but going into the past it was always the Frost team, so Mig Frost, Azubu Frost, CJ Frost. I mean, in terms of accomplishments, one of the greatest players of all time, absolutely one of the best at his position ever at support. So many OGN finals, won an OGN title, made a Worlds final, something like his first 4 or 5 lands he made the final of. But as a player, I feel like, unfortunately for people who weren't around during that time, even when you watch the clips, it's hard to get a sense or context for who he was as a player and what he was able to do and what he pioneered. Because he wasn't just a flashy player who made great highlight clips and there were other people who made those clips and something like that. Like, oh, he was just a good player. And like now, obviously, when you see him landing hooks or like Thresh hooks or Blitzcrank grabs, you're going to think now, well, every great Thresh player lands hooks and everyone says they're a god, and lots of people predict a flash and stuff like that. So a lot of it seems more mundane because of how assimilated it's become within the culture even of League of Legends and among fans of watching top players and what to expect from them. But this was one of the most startling, astonishing, incredible, marvelous players to ever come to League of Legends. The way he revolutionized this position and made us think differently of how the position could even be played and utilized, and the impact it could have on the lane and on the overall map and on team fights, it's almost above and beyond what any other player's ever done to any position when I try to think in history. Even what Wei Zhao did to AD carry, even what someone like Froggen did to mid lane and later Faker, even what people like Shy, Macnoon did to the top lane, even what Diamondprox did to the jungle. I think maybe Diamondprox in the jungle is the only other position where I think one player completely revolutionized aspects of how it was played, and that everyone else afterwards was to a degree copying some of it. But in that case, I think MadLife's even more so, because until Mata came along and just perfected every aspect of the role, MadLife just was the greatest support ever. He was the perfect support for a long period of time in every respect. So first and foremost, you have to start with the playmaking. Go beyond the accomplishments, the team stuff. Let's go individually, the playmaking. Back in the Season 2 days, when he was playing stuff, like his most famous champ was obviously Blitzcrank, and this is before the era of Thresh, so it was the Blitzcrank grab, where you grab the guy and you pulled him towards you. Not only was he the best at making these plays in lane, like the flash grab, or just the grab as in being able to weave through like a couple of minions go, so the enemy think, as every solo queue player now knows when you're playing Blitzcrank, you torture the Blitzcrank by constantly standing behind the minions, by coming back behind the minions when he's about to fire the grab, and you fuck with him that way. So he's got nothing at that point. He's miles away from you, and he's not going to be able to get his other abilities off. MadLife could thread the needle, as they say, so perfectly. He was the best by far, and no one else could even conceive of some of these grabs he could make. In lane, he could make these playmaking moves that at the time, if you were an aggressive support, you were aggressive to zone people, to bully them away a bit. He was the one who took this beyond that, and he was playmaking in the lane, getting kills for his AD carry, getting kills himself, solo onto enemies, making enemies have to constantly be worried about him, so that in the case of Lokodoko would be aggressive, and in the case of Woom, his other AD carry later, Woom could actually be passive and could just farm up and be safe, because his support's fucking with the enemy, constantly in their heads, actually making kills, getting plays on them, putting them at disadvantages, so that it allows the laning phase to go in the favour of his team. But beyond that, yes, there was the blitz hooks that, like, wow, the mechanics of that, because he had the best mechanics of any support by far. But it wasn't just the mechanics to make like a great play, like, oh, I can see what he was doing there and he managed to hit it, wow, it's so hard to hit that shot. That's one thing. But he would make these grabs that were impossible. And when I mean impossible, some of these highlight grabs, I always feel like on some of the highlight movies, they didn't do a good enough job of showing this, but some of them he would make over walls, were into areas that had no vision. And he would just had an intuitive sense for where an opponent could be, where they would be heading once they went into an area with the fog of war with no vision. He could kind of sense like, okay, if I fire it here, they'll have just gotten there at that point in time. He was incredible, obviously, at predicting dodges. That's where the MadLife came from. It wasn't just that you land a sick hook or a sick grab or a sick skill shot. It's that you do it to where the opponent will actually not only be dodging, but where they will flash to is where you're preemptively firing it, so that they flash into it and you look like a god. Because at the time, when no one's even gotten this concept down and no one's trying it as much, only people trying it in solo queue randomly, he's doing this in real live games and hitting them like more than 50% of the time, put it that way. He was the god. No one could conceive of these plays. Getting solo kills as a support. I mean, who was doing this? No one at the time. Obviously, at the time, he had his sonar as well. He was very good with that. Alistair, he could hit that combo perfectly every time. So he could just bully you as in lane. And if you think about it, Alistair with his heal and doing this combo, you can see how he could keep someone like Woong alive. Now, what allowed him to make some of these plays, first and foremost, yes, mechanics. Mechanically, at the time, unfortunately, because of the role it was as like a ward bot, people did just think of support as like, that's the guy that you give, who's got the weak mechanics, like an elements type guy. You just put him there, and then you just hope that you do all right, and then you'll just have to play using your mind and team playing. That's going to be your main strength. No, mechanically, MadLife had the mechanics of a star mid laner, a world-class mid laner, a world-class top laner, a world-class AD carry, the beast positions mechanically. He was as good as them mechanically, but applying it to support, which then allowed him to do things other supports couldn't do. He had an inconceivable level of playmaking, as I've described. It's like, I've always said it like this, okay? There's like a famous saying, okay, that says, it's about genius, that says something like, actually, I'll look it up quickly because I want to get it right. It's like, it goes along the lines of, right here, I found the quote here. So the quote, it says, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Now, along those lines, I have like a similar way of thinking about MadLife's plays in terms of his raw playmaking ability and some of the grabs and hooks, etc. he could land in the game. Because it's like, yes, other players could hit a lower level of them. So it's like top players could make plays that you couldn't believe because you were like, wow, he actually hit that shot. Like, yeah, I could see the shot, but it looked like he wouldn't be able to hit it. A top player could do that. With MadLife, it was like he could make plays and he could hit grabs and hit skill shots you didn't know existed. You couldn't even visualize or conceive that this play was possible, and he not only could conceive of it in an instant as it presented itself, as a quality actually that I think he shares with Faker later on, in terms of Faker's aggressive 1v1 mid lane laning, playmaking and aggression. He had that in terms of he could instantly visualize it was possible and then without hesitation execute it. Not even have to think about how would I do that or have to do it multiple times. Could just somehow do it. And then somehow there was a perfection in doing it where it would work so many times. It's not like he would make these flash grabs with Blitzcrank and just miss a bunch of times. And then the opponent was like, haha, now we've burned his flash and he missed and that's on cooldown. No, he would make these plays an astonishing amount of time. And then not only was he doing it and then getting the kill and getting the play, but then the fear of that, what he could do, added an extra element to his zoning, to how opponents had to play against him, to how they had to be thinking themselves, the mind games that would go into it. That added a whole extra dimension that no one else in the game had at the time, especially no support player. Then you go beyond that. He was a guy that his understanding of the abilities that opposing champions could do to him and what his kit could do to theirs. I once did an interview with Crepo, a grilled interview back in 2013, where he made this point about a specific champion matchup. I forget exactly which champion, but the point he made was, until he saw MadLife doing this and repeatedly abusing it, he never really thought about the concept of like, if you have a certain champion and you understand very carefully like a slight range advantage you have, if you purposely constantly control the game, so you're abusing that slight leash, like the little extra distance that you have that you can get off where he can't attack you and you can move in, attack him, move out, do the ability, move in. If you can understand that sliver, that range, that kind of razor's edge and walk it finally, you can utterly dominate an opponent in a way where he has almost no way to play back at you. And yet most players, it might sound obvious now, people might have learned these concepts now obviously, but at the time people just didn't think this way. They didn't understand the game on such an intuitive, such an effective and efficient way to play, and yet MadLife had this from very early on, the first season that Koreans even had a server. In terms of these mechanics, these also allowed him, after Loco Doco, who was an aggressive AD carry, but would always make these, the Loco leaps, these like overly aggressive plays. So obviously he had to be able to make these plays along with him. But then when he had Woong, this much weaker AD carry, his mechanics and his playmaking allowed this weak AD carry to survive in an elite level team that was making the finals, was making world championship finals, and not just get utterly dumpstered at AD carry position. So the way he was able to carry lane there especially was very impressive. But the problem is, everyone now who's only seen the videos will just only think of MadLife as the playmaker. So yes, I've talked about Blitz, and obviously when Thresh came in, that almost seemed like a champion made for MadLife, because it not only had the hook, but then it had the fucking lantern that he could bring in another player. I mean, you remember the amazing kill he had onto Flame in the river, when Frost plays Blaze. I think it was in the spring OGN semi-finals. just an incredible kill where he brings the teammate in on the lantern after he's made the hook and put the box around him. Like now, these plays, yes, we see Bonnie Fufu doing them all now, years later, like 2 years later. At the time, these were just mind-blowing plays that he could pull off all of this, and the first time he tried it, So yes, everyone knows him for the playmaking, and now maybe you understand the full context of the playmaking. But what's funny is that wasn't even the best thing about MadLife. Yes, that was crazy what he could do, but it's not like he played with Wei Zhao and as a result they just dominated every bot lane and these playmaking just ended the game. What made his team the best was his team was sick at late game team fighting. So the way they would get to the points of being able to get to the late game with whatever scaling champs they wanted and be able to win these fights was they had the best vision control in the entire game. MadLife was by far the best player and in many ways the first player to master vision control. So he was the best at warding, deep warding, being able to roam. He was pretty much the prototypical roaming support because of how he would play. He would roam where other supports just stayed in lane, just stayed with the AD carry. At the time, obviously it wasn't the trinket system, so there wasn't the same limitation on the number of wards you could place. So a player like him, especially paired with and also a supportive style jungler like Cloud Templar, they would get amazing vision control, and that started with MadLife in the same way as a lot of what helped Dandy in his great play was Mata's great warding. His warding was phenomenal. People literally learned warding and when to do it and how to do it and the timings of what you're warding to set up for from watching MadLife play. Absolutely phenomenal. Then on top of that, at the time, again, it wasn't a trinket system, so at the time you had the Oracle's Elixir, which you could take, if you got an advantage in lane, you could take this and you could clear vision. Now, combined with his warding, with his understanding of where the enemy's going to be, and oracles, he could now clear a lot of vision. And so the vision dominance that someone like MadLife could exert over the game was utterly insane. It really makes me wonder if they'd never brought in that trinket system, what by the time you get to a Season 4 world, someone like Mata and what Samson White could have done with the old ward system. It would have been absolutely scary. If you think what they did now was scary, this would have been utterly terrifying. They would have just dominated games in a way where no one could come back after like 20 minutes probably. He was by far the best in this regard. In fact, I remember at the time in like mid 2013, the only person anyone was even comparing to him was actually Loveling, back when Loveling used to be a support player. People were saying he had like comparable vision control at the time, but obviously playing in China, you were never going to get the same plaudits for vision control as a Korean was. Now, what's interesting is MadLife was to really clarify and put emphasis on what an exceptional player he was to all level of players. First of all, in interviews publicly and in privately, I could talk to any level of player. Like I could talk to Froggen when he was the best mid. I could talk to some, let's say like Soaz. I could talk to Doublelift. Any of these players who at the time were among the best at their positions, and all of them were like, no, MadLife is a god. Like he's just the best player. He's the greatest. Even players at traditional carry roles were like, this guy's the best. He's just unreal. Like I can't even believe what he's able to do. And so as a result, the thing you have to understand about the context of MadLife's career is that he was so exceptional that literally like myths and legends grew up around who he was and what he was able to do. That not even, now you think of them and they seem laughable, some of them, but some of them have a grain of truth to them. So okay, number one, and this will seem like a joke when I tell you that people believe this. Monte Cristo believed this. Most people in the West believed this when we heard this story because he was this exceptional. There was a story that said that within Frost, they had their own modified version of the League client where a teammate of MadLife's could control the minion wave. So they weren't just moving in like that, they could like move individual minions. And as a result, MadLife would sit in lane all day against like a bot server like this, a guy moving the minions, and he would just practice firing blitzcrank grabs through the minion wave, firing thresh hooks through the minion wave, so that he could learn as those two minions went up like that how to get it exactly through and be perfect. Now obviously this client did not exist. I've looked into it, I've asked people about it. As far as I know, this does not exist. This was an absolute myth, a legend built up. Now why did this myth, why was this not only propagated, but why was it believed by people? Because that's how exceptional this guy was at the grabs and hooks, that no one else was at this level, that everyone thought he can't just be doing it like us, he can't just be playing solo queue and getting to do it like 15 times in the early part of the game in the laning phase, and then these can't be the first times he's trying some of these plays in games. He must be doing something secret to train himself to be better than the rest of us and to be better than everyone else and to have these mechanics that are otherworldly. He wasn't. He was just doing it like everyone else. He just was that above the level of everyone on that intuitive way to play, and then having the mechanics to pull off these plays. In that sense, at support, in a way, he was like a faker, but of support. He was that exceptional. I mean, I will point out some of these myths also came from the fact that in Season 2, Frost also had this mythos around them of secrecy where they wouldn't practice that much and they don't do secretly, and then they had this whole story where they would send Blaze out to practice opponents, then come back and mimic the style of the opponent so they could get practice against that opponent but without ever actually playing them. So there was a whole genuine mystique built up around them anyway. So another one was that on his monitor, he had every cooldown for every champion written, and he'd memorized them all. Now, I don't doubt he probably did have a lot of cooldowns written. A lot of players have done this. A lot of players have made the attempt to memorize them. But it's obviously ridiculous, the notion that he had literally memorized every single cooldown, regardless of, like runes, etc., and would know exactly when they were. But the reason why people thought this is because, again, one of the crazy things about how Frost would teamfight is their ability to fight just before the cooldowns came off for the enemy. So they got the jump start on them and had a slight advantage, was uncanny. And this, in theory, came from MadLife. He was doing a lot of this, and he was the guy who was sort of running the game in that way. There was actually an old school Quake player, this reminds me of, called CZM, who's a TDM player, team deathmatch, 4v4, and he used to do this for his teammates. He used to time all the items in his head. Now, normally, a player would time 1 or 2 himself. Like, if he plays this position, he's going to time this armor. He could time 3 or 4 to the second by himself while playing individually and being the star player himself as well. So as a result, he could dominate the whole game. Now, Quake has a higher skill cap, obviously, in things you can do than League of Legends, but you can see how MadLife's impact in this way was helping his team be this phenomenal team fighting team late, and how they could always come back from like 5k gold deficit to still win the game. You would add in the playmaking, the warding, this cooldown ability, mechanics. So another myth about him was that because his mechanics were so otherworldly, he only became a lowly support, ward bot, because that was the only role left. That was the role that Frost needed, and so he was like, hey, I can just be support. So if they'd needed a mid laner, if they'd needed a top laner, roles at the time with the ultra carries, needed an AD carry, he could have been the AD carry. Now, listen, that is to a degree true. He kind of said that when I did my interview with him, but it's not true in as much as it's not like he was just forced into the position. It's not like he was like, oh, well, I guess since we just don't have one. And it's not like he necessarily would have been a shoo-in to be the best at one of those roles, which is kind of the implication of that, because that's the legend of it. It's the idea that, oh, well, the reason why he's so mechanically better than every other support is he shouldn't even be support. He could be the best mid laner in Korea. Like, maybe. I don't necessarily think so, though, because when I think the kinds of playmaking he had, and especially his vision control aspect, I think he wouldn't actually have been as great a player in terms of impact, actually, because he wouldn't have had the same vision control impact from, like, top lane or mid lane, obviously. So I don't think it actually would have made him as great a player. I think he played the right position for himself. In fact, if you look, the advantages he had playing this position compared to others at the same position is what made him, at the time, the greatest ever, until Mata kind of surpassed him in some of these aspects, by refining them. Not necessarily pioneering to the same degree, but refining and making perfect things that MadLife had put in place. Making a science of that art, if you will. But obviously there is something to that. His mechanics were above and beyond. So I hope I've defined here not only the strengths of MadLife and the things he did uniquely and the things he pioneered that many have since copied, like the roaming, the playmaking, the vision control, how to zone it with AD carry who's weaker, all these qualities but obviously leashing, being able to understand when cooldowns are coming off, all these things are great, but one of the key things about him that was important to understand is that it's not just that he was doing this when everyone else was. He was nearly always ahead of everyone. Everyone else learned these things from him, and the fact that they're mundane now is as a result of him and what he was able to do. And that's why these crazy stories are built up around him to build the legend, because he was such a superlative player. It was beyond words almost.